Well, this video kind of went off the rails. Today on ADG Pro, my original plan was to jump back into an old favorite, EarthSiege, to investigate how its energy mechanics work, as it's one of those things which you kind of have a basic understanding of as a player, but which is never really properly explained. I mean, sure, if we go into the hangar here, we can see the energy weapons list how much energy they consume, but those are the only numbers we're given. We have no idea how much energy the HERCs themselves are able to store at a time, or how quickly they're able to recharge that energy, or how those energy values translate into damage against the enemies. That was the original plan. But as I was doing my preliminary work to figure out how difficult this was going to be and what I would need to investigate, I made kind of a horrifying discovery. Pretty much every mechanic in this game, damage, energy, shields, all of them are filled with lies. What little hard data this game actually provides you is inconsistent at best and a complete fabrication at worst. So this ended up becoming more than just an investigation into the energy mechanics, and instead I decided to broaden the focus into the weapon stats in general. But before we can dive into those and how I went about figuring everything out, I do want to quickly touch on a mechanic which fooled every single one of us: the shields. So here's the thing, every HERC in this game has a shield system in place to absorb incoming attacks, but one thing you're able to do is adjust the balance of the shields between the front and rear of the HERC. Naturally, you're going to assume this means the more power you put into one side, the better it will be at blocking incoming damage. But you ever notice how when your shields get hit, regardless of which side was hit, both sides of the shields drop? I think both myself and everyone else just assumed that the shields simply run off of a single power source and that the balance simply affected how much power was lost when either the front or back was hit. But after extensive testing, I can safely say that no matter how much you adjust the balance between 100 and 200 points, the amount of damage the shields can absorb before going down is identical. In fact, when you mess with the balance, the side which is below 100 points now ends up forming a gap before the shields are completely empty. So you're actually just making the shields fundamentally worse by adjusting them in any way. Any shield at 100 points blocks the same amount of damage as a shield boosted all the way up to 200. This is just a taste of how ridiculous these findings are about to get. However, before we can properly analyze the energy levels and weapons, we need to establish a baseline, and this is where things got a bit complicated for a variety of reasons. And the first thing I noticed in my preliminary testing is that any mechanics related to time are completely inaccurate and can fluctuate to a surprising extent. Basically, if you measure the time taken to do a particular thing, then measure that time taken again, it's not going to be the same. And since we need to rely on time to figure out a lot of these metrics, my results ended up with a considerable margin of error. So to that end, I'm not going to be presenting the exact numbers for a lot of my findings, since they're not consistent, and will instead be presenting nicer numbers which tend to make more sense given what we're seeing in the game. The second complication, though, is that we don't have full control over the mission parameters. The game offers 3 modes of play: instant action, single missions, and career mode. Well, career is definitely not going to work for this, and instant action basically just picks a random single mission for you, but it's otherwise the same as the single mission mode. Now, when we choose to play a single mission, there's actually more than one potential mission for each mission type, but one of the best ones I found to work with for testing things was one of the 2 types of patrols. When you select patrol as your mission type and get to the main briefing, you'll be able to tell immediately which of the 2 patrol missions you got by reading the first sentence. If it starts with "Cybrid recon units have been reported in the area," then that's a no-go. We want the patrol mission which starts with "We have reports that the Cybrids are stockpiling supplies," because that particular patrol mission starts us off at a friendly base with 1 wingman, and the very first thing we face on the patrol route is a line of 5 enemy turret towers, stationary targets ripe for testing weapons against. The third complication, though, are the flyers. Now, I'm pretty sure everyone agrees that the most annoying mechanic in all of EarthSiege, and even the sequel, are the flyers. They constantly respawn and constantly take pot shots at you. This wouldn't be such a big deal, except one of the things I figured out when testing the shields is that if your shields are not at maximum power, your energy regenerates at half its normal rate, which is going to affect our testing since we have to compensate for the energy levels constantly recharging to figure out how much energy everything is using. Now true, I've actually gone into the mission parameters and made myself invulnerable. However, this only affects the mechanical structure of your HERC. Its shields will still take damage even when your HERC itself is set not to. So to keep the flyers at bay for testing the energy weapons, there's a little trick we can do. And since we're starting at a friendly base with a wingman, as soon as the mission begins, we can tell our wingman to defend position at a point just a tiny bit ahead of the base, so that our wingman now advances ahead of us while we just stay put. This in turn will start spawning flyers, but those flyers will only see our wingman and not us, and will thus go after the wingman. We can thus let them go do their own thing while we just stay back at the base completely unhindered by the flyers so that we can test energy mechanics to our heart's content. There is also technically a fourth complication, as the manual mentions that your HERC's movement also taps into your energy, but I tested this out and it turns out, no, HERC movement and energy do not affect each other whatsoever, so that's not something we have to concern ourselves with. Anyways, the first question I wanted to answer was how much energy each HERC actually has. Now again, something I need to stress here is that the numbers reported in the hangar are not accurate, so we technically can't use them to determine our unseen energy limits, but I did notice at the end of all of my testing that for as inaccurate as everything was, the 300 gigawatt starburst laser actually consumes about 3% of your HERC's master energy pool to fire each shot. This was the only energy weapon with a reported number which lined up with an actual number. So we're going to use that as our baseline, thus meaning every HERC in the game has a master energy pool of 10 terawatts, or 10,000 gigawatts. But wait, I hear you screaming at the screen, that doesn't make sense. There's 8 different HERCs you can pilot, 9 if you have the expansion, and they range in size from the tiny Roadrunner to the towering Colossus. They can't all have the same energy limits. Yeah, well, guess what? They do. The tiny little Roadrunner has the exact same amount of energy available for its weapons as every other HERC you can pilot, the Colossus included. Even the recharge rate is the exact same between them all, as it takes roughly 1 minute to regenerate a HERC's energy pool from functionally empty to full. And I say it that way because the energy gauge in the cockpit of every HERC never bottoms out completely, with the actual bottom being a few points above where it looks like it should be. But that's just a visual thing, and when I noticed that this was happening, I did indeed account for it. Well, that does thankfully simplify things though, because it means no matter what HERC I'm piloting, we can use the same measurements to determine how much energy the different energy weapons are pulling. Since I not only had to measure how long it took for different weapons to bottom out the master energy pool, but I also had to compare that to how much energy would have been recharged in that same span of time. Thus, with all of those details in mind, let's see what the findings are. Now, there's only 6 energy weapons in the entire game. The 3 laser variants, 100, 200, and 300 gigawatts, particle beams, EMP cannons, and the electron flux. And because of the way the numbers worked out, we're saying that the 300 gigawatt laser is our baseline. So we're going to say that it consumes 300 gigawatts per shot. Using that as our baseline, the 100 gigawatt laser actually turns out to be 200 gigawatts. The 200 gigawatt laser is actually 250 gigawatts. The EMP and particle beam, both of which are reported as 1,000 gigawatts, are actually 1,200 gigawatts, with an asterisk, which we'll address in a moment. And the electron flux, reported as 1,500 gigawatts, is also 1,200 gigawatts, again with an asterisk. So the reason those last 3 are all asterisked is because one of the things you can adjust in your HERC is how much power each energy weapon is allowed to store at a time. And every energy weapon defaults to 1,200 gigawatts of power storage, adjustable between 0 and 1,600. All 3 lasers need at least 300 gigawatts stored before they're allowed to fire, and always consume their respective amount of power, while the other 3 energy weapons require a minimum of 600 gigawatts stored before they're allowed to fire, Though don't take this to mean the math is exact. Much like how the shields seem to be off by 1 point when you adjust them upwards, there's similar inaccuracies going on with the weapon set points, and thus you can sometimes end up with the more powerful energy weapons seeming to fire okay with only 500 gigawatts or needing as much as 700. But again, it's just inconsistencies in the math. I should also quickly point out, weapons take priority over shields, so if you run your power dry, your weapons all need to be refilled before the shields will start to recharge. With the EMP and particle beam, their entire power buffer is consumed when fired, and later on, when I calculated the damage output, I found the transition here was indeed linear. So there's not really any major drawbacks or benefits to using more or less power with these weapons. The electron flux, however, consumes its power buffer rapidly while being fired, but not all at once. Thus, if you let go of the button before it completely empties out, it'll still have some power left. And I should point out too that if you adjust any set points down, the excess energy doesn't magically disappear. It actually goes back into the master energy pool for the HERC, if there's space for it. So at least that part of the simulation isn't completely ruining everything. So yeah, when I realized the energy wasn't being calculated in an expected way, it dawned on me that I'd better check the rest of the weapon stats for all of the weapons, which comes down to range and damage. Now let's tackle range first, because this one's already extremely suspect, given that every energy weapon in the hangar reports its range to be the same value as its energy output. Yeah, all the range values are lies, but what's worse is that even the simulation is having trouble with the range values. Not just in terms of reported range, but even in terms of functional range. For instance, all 3 sizes of autocannons have a reported range in the simulation of 420 meters, as in, when selected along with a target, their indicator lights turn green to indicate a clean shot at 420 meters or closer. However, the actual effective range depends on multiple factors, which seem more random than anything else, as one of my first tests showed about 300 meters to be the minimum range, yet a second attempt on a nearby target immediately following showed 324 meters to be the effective minimum, even though 324 was too far to hit the first target. Now, since the autocannons are not hit scan weapons, this could again come down to how time seems to be measured inaccurately. Thus, if time is being used to determine actual range with the shots moving through the air, then that would explain the inconsistencies here. Nevertheless, even 324 meters is much closer than 420 meters. Now, before we continue, I should point out that the simulation is incapable of relaying range values which are not multiples of 6 for whatever reason. It's weird, but because of that, all of my estimates have to follow suit, as I have no easy way to check to any greater accuracy. With that in mind, all 3 lasers are reported in the simulation to have a range of 312 meters, but their actual range is slightly further, at around 330 meters. The EMP cannon reports as in range at 246 meters, with an effective range only slightly closer at 234 meters. The particle beam reports in range at 216 meters, and seems to match that in terms of effective range, while the electron flux reports as in range at only 90 meters, and has an effective range of 90 meters. There's also the missiles, but I want to give them their own special segment at the end of the video, so let's move on to measuring the damage output. There's a really funny thing going on with the damage values though, and while I tried my best to find some semblance of logical numbers which would make it all make sense, I wasn't able to do so, but I did notice a couple interesting things which helped to at least narrow down the possibilities. Although I should address that all of my testing here was against these stationary turrets which are unshielded, despite messages to the contrary which we'll get into in a moment, and as I wasn't able to effectively test how good or bad certain weapons were versus shields compared to armor, as the manual explicitly points out that lasers and missiles are terrible at penetrating shields, whereas the EMP cannon can shatter shields pretty quickly, and the electron flux just cuts straight through them as if they're not even there. So, when I tested the lasers against these stationary turrets, I found it took 55 shots to take one out with 100 gigawatt lasers, 28 shots with 200 gigawatt lasers, and 19 shots with 300 gigawatt lasers. Now, take a look at those numbers just as they are. At first glance, there doesn't seem to be any common factor to any of them, but something still seemed a bit too coincidental about them, and that's when I realized that having exactly 0 integrity still counted as being intact, as if you decrease each of these numbers by 1, they suddenly all become multiples of 9. There's even a way to prove this is happening in the simulation, as when you target a fixed structure of any kind, it only has one generic status condition based on how much integrity it has left. Above 90%, it has a rating of OK. Above something around 76%, it has a rating of shields DN for shields down. I wasn't able to narrow down the exact integrity percentage. Above 50%, it has a rating of int damage for internal damage, and anything at or below 50% is critical. However, if the integrity lands right on 0, it'll show destroyed despite very much still being intact. While this may seem somewhat ridiculous, I do not believe this damage label was ever meant to be seen on an intact structure, as occasionally when you destroy something properly, instead of losing the target lock immediately, it'll stay active until the structure finishes exploding, in which case you will properly see the destroyed status during the explosions. But there may also be some kind of weird rounding errors going on, since when I tested this theory out, the 100 gigawatt lasers would show these turrets as destroyed after 54 shots, not 55, and the 200 gigawatt lasers would show them as destroyed after 27 shots, not 28. But the 300 gigawatt lasers did not show the turrets as destroyed after 18 shots, and would then promptly take out the turrets on the 19th shots. I tested this further by combining various quantities of shots from the 100 gigawatt lasers and the 300 gigawatt lasers together, and most combinations led to the destroyed status showing up early, but a couple did not. Now, I happen to know that EarthSiege is running an engine called 3-Space, spelled with the numeral 3 in the title as one word, and that the 3-Space engine is entirely integer-based, as was typical given how relatively slow floating point calculations used to be before Pentium processors were a thing. So having rounding errors of any kind for damage calculations seems a bit odd. But then there might be other factors I can't measure, such as an armor divisor, weather modifications that were never fully implemented despite what the manual may say, or other oddities. So, with all of that in mind, I decided the best way to relay the damage values to all of you would be to give approximations relative to the amount of gigawatts worth of damage caused, especially since the 100, 200, and 300 gigawatt lasers seem to line up to each other pretty well in this regard. The only trouble with this approach is that the 50mm autocannon is going to have a very weird damage number, but whatever. Everything else lines up fairly well, so here you go, the compiled damage data. Now, right off the bat, when it comes to energy weapons, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to go with anything less than 300 gigawatt lasers if you have the ability to do so, as the smaller lasers have the same range but burn more energy to do less damage. Or heck, even the EMP cannon has a very low damage to energy ratio, but if the manual is correct, it can disintegrate shields very quickly, thus allowing weapons which are blocked by shields to a greater extent to get through. Again, presuming those shield mechanics are doing what they're supposed to, as there was no definitive way to test that. The particle beams are definitely your best bang for the buck though, but you do have to get a bit closer to use them, or if you're feeling really daring, the electron flux just annihilates everything. But you have to get really close to use it, and you have to keep the bolt sustained on the target for its entire duration of 72 frames, or just over a full second, given that the game runs at 70 frames per second. Again, I mentioned earlier that when it comes to the energy weapons set points, the damage scaling is linear. Thus, if you set the set point halfway down from its default for the particle beam and EMP, they both burn half as much energy and do half as much damage, so their ratios are still the same, while the electron flux simply drains out faster and thus gets less damage out, but its effective ratio also stays the same. As for the non-energy weapons though, we can see that the autocannons do a surprisingly large amount of damage. Even the smallest 20mm autocannon does a full 7.5 times more damage per shot than a 100 gigawatt laser. But the trick is it's a lot harder to aim since the shots do not instantly reach their mark. The 50mm autocannon is kind of weird though, and it's part of the proof that some kind of weird bit of rounding is going on, as it does exactly 12 2/3 more damage than a 100 gigawatt laser. Which again is a very weird metric, and while I was able to find multipliers which would turn everything here into proper whole numbers, those resulting numbers felt too arbitrary to be real, especially since the real values are likely decimal values themselves given what we've seen. But lastly, we have the missiles. Now, astute viewers who have played tons of the EarthSiege games are probably once again screaming at their screens, since I have only one entry listed for the missiles, despite the game giving you 4 missile options for all sizes of missile pods. active radar, semi-active radar, anti-radiation, and electro-optical. The idea, or so we thought, was that the easier the missile was to use, the smaller the warhead would be to account for all the extra avionics, and the shorter the range due to carrying less fuel. Well, I tested out all 4 missile types, and unfortunately, due to the mechanics of the engine, you can't actually target anything beyond 660 meters, which makes that the effective range of all missiles. Except technically the electro-optical missiles, but flying them blind beyond 660 meters really doesn't help anyways. And as for the payloads, every type of missile does the exact same amount of damage, equivalent to 34 shots from a 100 gigawatt laser. Yeah, this not only makes semi-active radar missiles worthless, given that they're now effectively just harder to use active radar missiles, but it also means there's no benefit to trying to use electro-optical missiles in active combat. Basically, take active radar for highest reliability, anti-radiation if you want to observe emissions control, electro-optical for taking out known structures from a distance or for scouting purposes, and leave the semis to rot away in your silos. Anywho, I think we're done here. I had a hunch EarthSiege wasn't being very honest with its stats, but I never guessed that they would be that far off kilter. And since the career mode focuses on having to acquire salvage, you generally pick your weapons based on what you have access to and can afford to lose if a mission goes sour. But ultimately, nearly half the weapons end up being worthless when you have better options on hand. Couple that with the fake shield balancing and the identical energy levels between all HERCs, and it almost seems to me like there was supposed to be more going on here than was ultimately implemented. Now, I will point out that if memory serves, the sequel, EarthSiege 2, has all of its range values accurate, so some of the other details there may also be updated and rebalanced to make more sense. And heck, maybe the shield balancing is also properly functional there too. But those are tests to perform for another time. Or if any of you decide to tackle it and post your results somewhere, feel free to drop a link in the comments. So that'll be all for today's ADG Pro. Next up, 2 Saturdays from now on March 18th will be a standard review, episode 310, where I'm going to be doing something I haven't done since I first talked about amulets and armor. And that's cover a game I only have the shareware version of, as I've never found the full version anywhere. But it's a game that's surprisingly fun despite how simple it is, and I'm really hoping the full version pops up online someday. So make sure to stay tuned to see what long-lost game I've got lined up to showcase. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to all the folks shown here supporting me on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show directly and see your name here as well, head on over to patreon.com/KASICK.